Okay, welcome everyone to sequencing and pre-confirmations call number 7. Today we have a couple of presentations, one by me on bootstrapping base pre-confirmations. How do we go from 0 to 1? And then we also have a talk from Sasha, who's going to share the Lido perspective on pre-confirmations and restaking more generally. So without much ado, let me try and share my screen and get started. Okay, bootstrapping based pre-confirmations. This is a fairly short talk, but hopefully has a couple ideas that might be new to you. So the talk is in two parts. First of all, I want to highlight two small tweaks to the design that I've been talking about so far. And those two tweaks kind of help with the bootstrapping process, in my opinion. And then two, I want to talk about the coordination game that's involved. It's kind of this multi-party, complicated game, and like how can we try and simplify it to get to mainnet as quickly as possible. Okay, design ideas. So idea number one, it tries to solve the problem of the empty look ahead. So in the ETH research post on base pre-confirmations, there's basically this requirement that in order to have pre-confirmations at every slot, you need at least something like 15 to 20% of validators opted in, so that you have a non-empty look ahead, at least one sequencer in the look ahead. And 20% of all ETH staked is about $20 billion. So it's we're asking a lot in terms of operators opting in, and there's this really cool idea from LimeChain, which I call sequencer fallbacks, which basically totally removes this requirement. We can basically launch with one single validator that opts in, as opposed to 20% of validators. So the idea is super simple. It's basically pick a sequencer at random whenever the look ahead is empty. So you basically look at the registry of sequencers that have put down collateral, for example, 1,000 ETH. They are candidate sequencers, but it's so happened that right now there's none of them in the look ahead. Well, just choose one at random. Now, one of the questions you may have is, isn't this a little complicated? Because now, the at slot n plus 31, this random sequencer doesn't have proposing rights, and so all the pre-confirmations that they've made, they can't actually guarantee settlement. But there's a kind of a few remarks here. Like, remark number one is that Ethereum layer 1 is already like relatively censorship resistant. If you want to get a transaction on chain, you can get it, usually within one slot, like in the next slot, but like with extremely high probability, you can get it within, let's say, 4 slots. And so for the first 28 slots, kind of 32 minus 4, it's actually very, very safe for this random sequencer to be giving pre-confirmations. And what they can do is they can stop at slot 28 giving pre-confirmations, because those are kind of more risky pre-confirmations. And so in some sense, we've reduced the problem from having 32 slots without pre-confirmations to just having 4 slots without pre-confirmations. So that's already quite nice. But it turns out we can do like a little bit better, especially during the bootstrapping phase. So what we can do is look at the next sequencer who will show up eventually in the look ahead. And there's several cases. Like, case number one is that these two sequencers in green are actually the same entity. And that might actually happen with relatively high probability at the beginning if there's like only 1 or 2 gateways. Another possibility is that these guys are actually friendly to each other. Like they know each other, they trust each other. So it could be, I don't know, the Titan relay and the ultrasound relay, for example. Like we loosely collaborate, like there's kind of this weak trust involved. And so what you can do is basically ask this sequencer to take into account all the pre-confirmations that were made here, even though they might not be settled on chain yet. And so, yeah, especially during the early days where I expect just a handful of gateways, all of which will know each other, all of which will probably be participating in these calls. I think we can actually have pre-confirmations at every single slot, even with a tiny fraction of the validators actually opting in. Any questions on this first idea of sequencer fallbacks?
Sorry, I don't understand what happens if the sequencer from n plus 33 gives pre-confirmations from n to n plus 32, and it overloads this where it could not respect them, and now it falls back to, it comes to their own slot. Do they have to fulfill all of them? What if they're given more than the block space they have access to?
Okay, so there's several things here. Like, first of all is that the sequencer slot n plus 33, they only have precedence over these three slots, n plus 32 all the way up to n plus 33. They don't have the ability to do pre-confirmations here. Another thing is that in general, as a sequencer, you don't want to give out too many pre-confirmations, because otherwise you might grow a backlog, as you said, that you can't fulfill. And so really what you want to be doing is, as you give pre-confirmations, you kind of want to include them on chain, relatively quickly. And here for this random sequencer, there's opportunities to kind of clear the queue as he goes along. But for this slot n plus 31, this is especially problematic to give pre-confirmations, because if they give a pre-confirmation, they basically need to make sure that it arrives in this slot. It settles here in this slot. But if they're friendly with the pre-conf slot n plus 31, well, this friendly sequencer will just say, okay, even though you didn't get your pre-confirmation included here, I'll try to just include it in this one or this one. I'll kind of take it under my umbrella, if that makes sense.
And that's why there's this window between 31 and 33, because the slot might not arrive by 33. What's the relationship between n plus 33, n plus 32, and n plus 31?
So n plus 31 plus and n plus 33, these are controlled by the same sequencer, and these here are all controlled by the same sequencer. So that's already one key difference. And like the awkward part is basically this transition phase when we go from one sequencer to another one. And basically what I'm arguing is that this transition phase is actually just a few slots. It's something like 4 slots. If you can get a transaction on chain within 4 slots with very high probability, then that's a relatively small transition phase. But you can basically get this transition phase down to 0 if these two guys know each other, which more likely than not is going to be the case in the first few weeks and months.
In the current setting, it's assumed that the sequencer is sequencing for the whole epoch, right?
Not necessarily. So, I mean, in this specific slide, then yes, the random sequencer is for the whole epoch. But in general, if there's lots of green sequencers here within the slot, then they'll have only fractions of epochs. Does that answer the question? So if there's like 3 sequencers in this epoch, then they will each have, one of 3 parts of the epoch.
Justin?
Assigned to, yes.
Just as a quick remark, another option there is for each of the gray slots to have one of these randomness there. Just to mention it as an option
yes.
there.
But one of the difficulties with doing that other option is that you're increasing the number of transition points. So here there's only 1 awkward transition point, whereas if you have like lots of random ones, you might have 32 awkward transition points. And like, the awkward transition points can either be smoothed out with this assumption that you can get transactions on chain within 4 slots. That's fine. Or with this kind of this friendliness assumption that these entities actually know each other and they're talking to each other. I mean, this notion of forwarding pre-confirmations from one entity to another could also be helpful whenever, you know, this sequencer just can't handle the load. So there's more than 30 million gas of pre-confirmation requests in this slot, and basically the sequencer here needs to tell users, okay, please start talking to this other sequencer.
So in that case, we're kind of creating a pre-conf pool, just like we have transaction pools.
Yes, you could say that like sequencers in the look ahead are kind of like a pool. It's like a scarce resource, and once it's fully consumed, then you can try and go to the next one to get a pre-confirmation.
Sorry, a nitpick here. Slot n plus 31 is twice on the slide. Is that an error or is that intentional?
Oh, shit. Yeah, that's an error. That should be 32, 33, 34. Apologies for that.
Oh, okay. So wait, so the proposer or the sequencer at slot n plus 33 is actually n plus 34. So that's in the next epoch?
Yes, so they're not part of the look ahead like right now, but they will be in the look ahead eventually. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's a typo here. I got my numbers wrong. Now, the other idea is to try to solve the problem that at the very beginning, there will be like 0 incentives to provide pre-confirmations. It will be kind of a loss leading type of activity. And asking pre-confers to put down, you know, stake that can be slashed, in my opinion, is a really big ask, especially with nascent code, which could be buggy. And so the suggestion that I have instead is, what if we relax the slashing to just freezing? So we still require sequencers and gateways to put for 1,000 ETH, because that's eventually what we're going to need. But instead of slashing it, we just freeze it whenever there is a bad event. So there's 2 types of bad events, right? There's the safety faults and lively faults. If either of these happen, then you freeze the stake for 1 week, for example, or 1 day, or some amount of time. And during that amount of time, that entity can't provide pre-confirmations anymore. So it's almost like a timeout. And sure, like this entity will be suffering the opportunity cost of money, you know, which for 1,000 ETH is actually, you know, not totally negligible. And so what I expect this cost of money to potentially be greater than the MEV opportunity and whatnot from sequencing in the early days. And so what I expect will happen if we do ask sequencers to put in with 1,000 ETH is that we won't see any tourists. Like we will only see people who really care about bootstrapping this network. And it will be. So go ahead, or was it just maybe just someone who is not muted? Okay. Any questions on this slide here?
Can't we do just like when we bootstrapped Ethereum 2, like for a year, we have reduced penalties?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, we could have a curve, which literally starts at zero slashing, and then over time kind of ramps up to 100% slashing. And it could be a tapered thing. Yeah, for sure.
Is there an argument to have more issuance towards the people that are like running these relays, and as a result, the time value of money is even higher because now you're missing out on potential rewards?
So issuance from the L1 to compensate.
Yeah.
Yeah, this changing issuance is like a huge can of worms. It is something that's not done lightly. I don't think that's feasible.
I think users should just pay for it.
Yes, but like at the very beginning, there will be literally like 0 pre-confirmation requests until integrations are made and yeah. So really, the people who will be coming in at the beginning, for example, ultrasound, like we're interested in helping out with pre-confirmations. Like we're happy to have a loss leading business, and sometimes that's what we've been doing for years now. But yeah.
Just the only challenge maybe with this is in the initial stages. Like, let's say you only have 2 of these and they both get frozen. So you're kind of like paying people. That's the only, but like, I forget who said you could do like the curve. So you like get this, initially there's, maybe it's only freezing for an hour. And then over time you start to increase that or something like that. But that could be a problem. It's like if you freeze 2 of the 5 out, what are you going to do?
Right, that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, one thing we could do is if there's one sequencer left, then it's unfreezable because it's the last remaining one. But yeah, did you say 2 of the 5? I mean,
yeah, once you get the network going, it's not a big deal. I think it's just like initially have to think about like how we phase it in. I think so, and people get their hand around this and things.
Right. I mean, I think users might also be willing to suffer like the degradation at the beginning, because in some sense this is an additional feature wouldn't be present otherwise. So it's in some sense a strict improvement.
Well, users would be using a base rollup that would be competing with rollups that already have pre-confirmation. Right. So they're actually kind of already used to having pre-confirmation.
That's true. But Tycho at first will launch without pre-confirmations. And so in some sense, for Tycho users, it is a strict upgrade. But yeah, point taken, Andrew. I think this is a good point. We should think about how long to freeze if we do go down this direction. Okay, so those were the 2 tweaks to the design that might help with bootstrapping. And then part 2 is just thoughts on the coordination game. And I think to a very large extent, the effort to get from 0 to 1 is like 80% coordination. And it's something that I do want to help with in 2024. So one idea is basically to use Tycho as a template, as a starting point. Tycho will be the first mover. It will launch its mainnet, I believe, this month. And the nice thing about Tycho is that they're, as far as I can tell, completely opinionated on like specifics of the pre-confirmation design. Like right now, they're head down working on their mainnet without pre-confirmations. And as far as I understand, they've been talking with all sorts of entities that could help them out, build out the infrastructure. So there's these consultancies, LimeChain and Nevermind, and there's startups that are also working on pre-confirmation. And so what I hope will happen is that like all these entities kind of compete with each other and share ideas, and then Tycho ends up picking the best solution, or at least a solution which is good enough, and that whatever they pick is kind of good enough to become a shining point for everyone to copy. And so one of the things that I want to make sure is that Tycho doesn't rush in, right? Like between when they launch on mainnet without pre-confirmations and when they actually do pick the pre-confirmations, that there is a real process of deliberation involved. The other ideas that I have are regarding credible neutrality. So if we want like this initial selection by Tycho and this initial infrastructure to catch on to the whole ecosystem, it needs to be credibly neutral. And there's basically two parts to pre-confirmations. One is, how do you elect the sequencers? And in some sense, Tycho will have monopoly power there in terms of setting the example. And then you have the sequencer commitments, like what types of commitments are made, and how is the slashing done. And the nice thing here is that the sequencer commitments is like a totally open market, totally permissionless. And in some sense, Tycho has no power here. So they have full power here and no power here. Now, one of the things that might be a big advantage while bootstrapping is that there's going to be very, very little MEV. There's going to be little activity, little MEV, which means that we might actually not need redistribution. Right? There's a lot of teams out there thinking about tickets and redistribution. Well, if there's no MEV, there's maybe no need for redistribution. And one of the advantages of having no redistribution is that it means that you might not need to have a token. And so having no token could, at least in the short term, be a way to gain more credible neutrality. And then on the sequencer commitment side of things, as I mentioned, it's totally permissionless for anyone to come in with proposals for commitments. And one of the things that I think would be kind of potentially a bad thing is if different pre-confers give out different types of pre-confirmation, it would be kind of a mess from the point of view of the user. You wouldn't have a very homogeneous market. And so here I kind of have two suggestions. Like maybe the simplest suggestion is just to go with the status quo of how pre-confirmations are done. What is the status quo? Is basically first come, first serve. And this is something that wallets like MetaMask have already integrated in, and so there's probably like specs out there where there's already a notion of a pre-confirmation request, a pre-confirmation promise, and all we need to do is add the freezing and the slashing whenever this promise is not respected. And one of the really nice things here is that from the point of view of wallets wanting to provide pre-confirmations, there's very little room for maneuver. They either connect to the next pre-confer or they don't connect to the next pre-confer. So from their perspective, it should be a very simple integration, and pretty much the same integration that's done with centralized sequencers, except that behind the scenes it's a rotating one. So instead of having just one IP address that you connect to, you just change the IP address that you connect to at every slot. And then there's kind of the more messy but maybe like more rewarding way forward, which is that we start doing all sorts of exotic pre-confirmations, and we have these very advanced and sophisticated pre-confirmation markets. And like I think diversity is great, but maybe the more organized way of doing it is like first there's a standardization phase, and then there's diversity of implementation. So there's in some sense like agreement on what the protocols are, and then there's diversity of implementation, as opposed to having a plurality of protocols, which kind of lead to this fragmented user experience from the point of view of users. Okay, now here's a little timeline of how I think about progress in 2024. And I think 2024 is the year where we go from 0 to 1. So how do we get there? So today we have the call number 7, and then we have the Tycho launch happening later this month. And in terms of events that will help out, there's 3 of them that I want to highlight. So we have these 2 sequencing days that are happening, one in Zoo Berlin and one at EthCC. And during Edge City in Zuzalu, one of the ideas that I have is to organize a whole sequencing week. So for 5 days, we just focus on sequencing in person in Thailand, which is where Edge City will happen. And what I'm hoping will happen is that each of these events where we actually meet in person will be a catalyst for a major milestone with pre-confirmations. So for example, in Zoo Berlin, where we're going to be spending multiple days together, I'm hoping that by the end of it or a few days later, we will have some sort of DevNet for pre-confirmations. And so, yeah, what I'm hoping will happen is that a lot of the teams currently building pre-confirmation infrastructure do come to Zuberlin, and at least within within this hacker house, we can have an initial DevNet. For EthCC, there's going to be again a sequencing day, and I'm hoping that a few days later after that we can have a testnet, and then 7 months between now and Edge City, I'm hoping we can basically have mainnet. I don't want to push things to December because usually not much happens in December, but I think we can actually get Taiko mainnet pre-confirmations, well, not just Taiko, but for everyone around this amount of time. That feels reasonable to me. And I think what will happen is that once we have this in mainnet, all sorts of other the base rollups can come in. So for example, Rise, which is a base rollup, they said they want to launch in Q4, which is kind of perfect timing because pre-confirmations will be ready, hopefully, by then. And that's it. Happy to take questions, and then we can move on to Sasha's talk. So yeah, happy to take questions or comments on the design ideas, the two design ideas that I presented, or some of the coordination tactics that we can use.
How many people do you think are going to opt in?
Oh, I can hear a voice. Can you speak a little bit louder?
Sorry, it's my microphone. How many people do you think will opt into being pre-confers, based on that timeline?
Right. Well, yeah. So one of the things that we won't have by 2024 is execution tickets or execution auctions, which like completely decouple validators from pre-confirmations. And so when we talk about a pre-confer in that context, we're really talking about pre-confirmation gateways, which is basically the entity that you, as a validator, you delegate to. I'm expecting at least one, which would be like the ultrasound relay, coming in as a pre-confirmation gateway, but I'm hoping that others will come in. Titan expressed interest, Chainbound expressed interest, maybe like Lido could come in with a pre-confirmation gateway. Coinbase might come in. I think we might have a handful, by the end of the year. At least that's my hope.
Justin, can I add one more thing in here to Simon's question? I think something that we should consider is the incentives of the proposers to actually opt in as part of Simon's question. And in order for proposers to get in, it needs to be very, very easy for them. And if it's as easy as essentially having an upgrade on MevBoost or a drop-in replacement of MevBoost, I think it's going to lend itself to much easier early participations by proposers. So I think this is something that also the Flashbots team should be part of this conversation, because like for me, they hold a significant key towards the adoption of all of this.
Right, agreed. Yeah, I think in the ideal case, it's basically a tiny modification to MevBoost. There's no additional computational resources or bandwidth or anything like that. Basically, instead of connecting to a relay, you connect to a gateway, and it's the same flow otherwise. The gateway gives you a header to sign, you sign it, and then that's it. Ellie.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to get my head around the different pieces of infrastructure that needs to be built for this to work. So I think that we have like the modification to MEV boost, like a modification to existing relays so that they can be these pre-confirmation gateways. Presumably some interface for like a user to actually request a pre-confirmation through like some wallet or something. Is there any like pieces I'm missing?
Right. We also need a registry on chain for
Yes.
the gateways to register and post collateral and get frozen. In terms of the integration with the wallet for the users, I think that already exists, right, for wallets like MetaMask.
Okay.
Andrew,
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe to just give a little bit more info. What's in there in MetaMask? Like, have they proposed the standard for pre-confirmations and they have embedded in MetaMask?
Right. So I actually haven't looked at the MetaMask code base, but my understanding is as a user, if you're using Optimism or Arbitrum, and you kind of click send on MetaMask, like you kind of get the green check mark immediately. That's part of the value proposition of Arbitrum and Optimism. And so in some sense, like there is already an API endpoint to send a transaction to a sequencer and get from the sequencer a confirmation or promise that your transaction will be included in some way, and here's your price. You already know how much you're paying. And so really what needs to change is the recipient of this API call. Instead of being the same entity, the centralized sequencer every single time, it's a rotating gateway. Ellie, have you had that?
Yeah, I guess as far as this registry for posting collateral, it seems like at least as far as I understand, I don't think EigenLayer could quite support, posting that level of collateral. So is the plan not to use something like restaking for this initial testnet and kind of roll our own, or what are your thoughts?
Right. So I did talk to 3RAM about this, and he did mention that it is possible to take multiple validators and expose the whole group against one slashing condition. So if something bad happens, actually 30 different validators get slashed at the same time. Having said that, in some sense, the gateways, if we think of them as being relays or entities like that, they don't necessarily stake. And so restaking for them might not be the natural move. Yeah, and there is also a concern about credible neutrality. If we do pick EigenLayer, then that is some sort of opinion that's being made. So I don't have a strong opinion here. My guess is that 1,000 ETH is a small enough amount that the additional yield from staking that you're missing out on is maybe not too much of a big deal. And also, one of the nice things about doing this is that, again, the opportunity cost might be higher than what you stand to make with pre-confirmation tips. And so really those who are showing up in the market are truly serious and in some sense altruistic, as opposed to being tourist kind of spamming and potentially degrading the experience early on.
Makes sense.
Andrew?
I just wanted to say, I'm not sure why my Zoom still says Reverend Howard. I'm no longer there, but shilling some efforts we have going out. So a couple of us are coming together and talking with a lot of proposers about, would they be, amendable to adapting, things, proposer commitments more generally, but our focus is pre-confs initially, but also inclusionless. And so far the conversations have been quite receptive. I think it's, not the big validators, but the ones that are more on the frontier side. So maybe even by June in Berlin, we'll have a DevNet on our side with how we're kind of thinking about plugging in proposer commitments to the proposer and have a good sense, better sense around, what are their requirements? How do they think about this? Even though the pre-conf market isn't huge, trying to get some bootstrap going. So probably in June, we'll have a lot more information, but if others are doing this, we're happy to engage and help. Doing this is open source, open development project. So no, specific company or team behind it. So hopefully credibly neutral.
Very nice. I think, Andrew, you'll be coming to Zoo Berlin, right?
I'll be there. Making it all the way to Berlin.
Nice.
Justin? Can
Yes.
I highlight a little bit of concern, just on the practical side, about the timeline? As people that have looked into the implementation side of this, you kind of, some implementations might require some forms of validation of the BLS keys of the proposers, of the validators, of the L1 validators. And just wanted to air a word of caution that if this is part of the implementation for some of the devnets or testnets that are there, the Pectra update needs to happen in order for the EAP for BLS verification to happen. And I'm not sure when this is scheduled for. Just it might impact the timelines that you're mentioning here.
Okay, gotcha. So that would be a gas efficiency, right? Thing.
Yes. This is when you want to, for some reason, you want to prove something about the validator, a specific validator in the validator set.
Right. That makes sense.
Do you have an idea of the gas cost with the currently proposed gas prices? Because I'm trying to petition for reducing the gas cost of the EIP 2537, but I had no feedback so far. Having an actual application would be helpful to lobby.
No, I don't. If this was for me, I don't.
I don't either.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, next up we have Sasha, who will talk about thoughts on pre-confs from Lido contributors. Sasha, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'll just put up my screen quickly and say hi, but bad internet, so I'm gonna cut it. Let's see if I can share. Start share. Okay, desktop. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. So here's the talk on Lido on pre-confs. It's, it's quite high level. It's not meant to be super technical, and it's more like, the end is basically open questions and a small call to action. The background on me is I'm currently a Lido contributor researcher. I've been base rollup build since I heard Justin present his vision back in October. Some relevant context today is Hasu has just proposed a suggested path forward for Lido in terms of the high level takeaway here is that the mission hasn't changed, but there is a need to respond to how much the market has changed over the last few months. And one of his suggestions is supporting Ethereum aligned validator services. Now, there's obviously questions about what Ethereum aligned, how to even define that, and one sort of, there are key constraints from our side with respect to not imposing any additional risk to stakers and not turning SDE into a restaking token. One sort of fun mental model here is, you can think of MEE Boost as a sort of restaking service in the sense that validators opt into additional constraints with the possibility of penalties, at least if they are operating using Lido. And there are several contributors. I mean, to give some sort of context for this, this talk, like I was very excited about based rollups back in October, November, and I raised it with a bunch of contributors that were more on the research and development side, because at the time I wasn't in the research, in Lido research, I was more on the governance team. But everyone was sort of very bandwidth constrained, and there wasn't really, while people were excited, there wasn't really any time to sort of think about how we could help here. But a couple of weeks ago, Eugene and Sam, two sort of core Lido contributors, reached out and said they were working on thinking about how to do this, and so that kind of led me to reach out to Justin and led to this talk. And sort of the high level here is, like, Lido does want to continue pushing the envelope forward with respect to staking, and that means sort of actively exploring these sorts of validator services. So the expectations from our side is that, at least from a number of contributors, are that pre-confs will be the next widely adopted validator service after MEV Boost. That there'll be an evolution, not a substitution of MEV Boost, and that there'll be the first of possibly a handful of Ethereum aligned sidecars. So there are sort of three potential directions here. The first is base pre-confs. Like, clearly Lido can offer access to its block space, but this would have to be opt-in from a subset of the validator set. And because we don't want to increase, we want to be prepared for any sort of tail risk scenario. It would involve probably an operator bond or collateral of some sort and an insurance fund. Ideally, it would support trustless hashing, but that doesn't have to be there at the beginning. I'm going to skip over this because it's not that relevant. Yeah, and so extending sort of base pre-confs, in general, we sort of see, or I see pre-confs as the first of possibly a handful of Ethereum aligned validation services, inclusion lists being another possible one. The key here, and why kind of we've been hesitant to say anything so far, is like, this doesn't work if Lido inserts itself as a point of influence or point of failure. So this is like what I liked about Justin's talk, for example, is that there might be a way to bootstrap pre-confs without needing like 20% of the validator set to opt in, and I think that would be great. That would be like actually like a more of a motivator for Lido to get involved, because we don't want to take away from the neutrality of this. I don't think it works if Lido is kind of, if it's dependent on Lido. So three high-level sort of values, philosophy, guiding philosophy North Star here is, the first is, like, redemption risk to users absolutely should not be increased. Like, Lido's brand truth, in my opinion, is really rooted in its security culture, almost bordering on paranoia. Like, it's hard to sort of get a sense of that from the outside, but when you're like working in the trenches there, it's like I've never seen as much attention to edge cases given as I have with the Lido devs. Yeah, so again, that it needs to stay focused on what makes it on its edge, right? Users need to always know the risks they're taking and where they're, what conditions their funds are being subject to, what constraints and conditions. And part of that involves thinking very long term and not letting, short-term market cycles or just avoiding the sort of the madness of crowds and sort of zooming out and saying, okay, actually, we need to build something that is long-term resilient. So open questions here. I mean, these are quite recent from my end. I've just sort of started diving deep again into based rollup. So after November, I was caught up in dual governance research and didn't have time to engage in these calls. But I've caught up with the calls, and these questions are really focused on credible commitments, because that's what I've been diving in this week. And so just reading them out, it's unclear to me, at least, what the best way to ensure credible commitments today is, and how to ensure this path is future-proof. It's also unclear to me whether Lido can just start with reputational collateral rather than economic collateral. If we do go with economic collateral, are enough node operators willing or able to post bonds? How large should the bond be? I mean, Justin mentions 1,000 ETH. I think that's one, hypothesis. Maybe we also need an insurance fund to sort of handle worst case scenarios, but then there's a question of how large should that be? Lido's recently made a lot of strides with DVT. So is there a way to leverage that to simplify things and make commitments more credible? Can you kind of lower the economic collateral if you have commitments that are enforced by several validators? Again, I'm not sure. Are there any EIPs that could make existing commitment designs more elegant? I haven't had the time to dig in yet. Do we expect there to be one winning pre-conf framework or protocol, or a plurality that can interface seamlessly together? Again, it's fuzzy for me. It's sort of the delineation between framework and protocol. Maybe there are many frameworks, one protocol. Again, don't see that clearly. Can Lido kind of choose a framework without discouraging experimentation? Should Lido be open to experimenting with more than one framework or protocol? Can Lido meaningfully improve the liveness guarantees of based rollups? So this sort of relates to a post by Chainbound, I think, that was released yesterday. One thing that jumped out for me there is there seems to be, at least with the current design, there is a liveness trade-off with their way of looking at things. And part of the promise for me, at least originally in November, with based rollups was the fact that we could inherit the liveness guarantees of DL1. Now, if we're relying on an external entity on top of the proposer, how much does that matter? I think they frame it really well. The question of that they ask, which is, what does it mean to be based? Is there a spectrum? What does the spectrum look like? How do the dimensions of finality and liveness you know, it's still unclear to me how to weigh up finality versus liveness if we're thinking about being based as a spectrum. Like my intuition is still that liveness should be weighted probably more, but again, it's like a loosely held opinion, and then, you know, it's also unclear to me whether Lido can improve this in any way. Yeah, and then finally, sort of more broadly, is there any way we can help bootstrap these base pre-confs without discouraging experimentation or influencing the outcome? Again, credible neutrality is what makes Ethereum special. Doesn't make sense to help with base rollups, which is about, you know, reinforcing what makes Ethereum special if we're going to detract from that. And in closing, sort of mini call to action, I'm open, and Eugene and Sam, who are sort of driving the research and development here, are open to collaborate with anyone who can help answer these questions, that wants to work with us. Feel free to email me, and I'll share my Telegram and Twitter in the chat. Okay, that's all. I don't know if I have time for questions.
Yes, we have time. We have 7 minutes left. Thank you so much, Sasha, for the presentation. I mean, for me, the big takeaways are that, like, one, Lido is now excited about base pre-confirmations. This was new to me even just you know, a couple of weeks ago. And it's partly because you now have more time on your hands because you've pushed the research for dual governance. And then the other big takeaway for me, which is very nice to hear, is that, like, you didn't really like the idea of using Lido as a mechanism for bootstrapping, right, to get the 20%, because
Right.
in some sense that meant pre-confirmations rely on Lido, and yeah, that's great to hear that you do care deeply about credible neutrality.
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously, if you're like the only perception people have from Lido is on sort of Twitter battles, then you don't get that. But I think it's something many people within Lido deeply care about, and there's no, yeah, this doesn't work if we're detracting from that in any way.
Any questions for Sasha?
Well, hey Sasha, it's been a while.
A long time.
So, what did I want to ask? Yeah, regarding reputational collateral, I think it's interesting because, like, if we want to ship pre-conf boosts or whatever the name, commitment boost, fast. I see two technical issues. One is the restaking part. If we need to connect to a restaking protocol, eigenlayer or something else. And two, it's a part with how do we, for builders, we ask them to, hey, please include this, while in the past there are they were used to building a blocks fully on their side. So if we can remove the economical restaking, that makes it easier to implement. So I think that's, and we also have, like, we rely on Relayer a lot, and they don't have any stake. So it's not like it's the first time that we do this either, or something that's opt-in.
Right. Yeah, I think, like, it's, again, I think it's like I mean, my intuition, and people can disagree here, but is that it's like the simplest way to move it forward, but there might be a trade-off in that. Maybe it puts too much reliance on Lido. So yeah, I'm again open to more thoughts on that, but agree it's like it does simplify things. But is the trade-off worth it? I'm not sure.
I mean, if we rely on reputational collateral, then Tyco needs to explicitly have a whitelist of who they consider to be reputation worthy, and then that might affect the credible neutrality a little bit of the sequencer selection mechanism.
Well, the idea that we have internally is that we commit to a date where we remove the training wheels, to say.
Right.
And even for testnet, we will likely use this to prove the concept before we add any complexity regarding restaking. Or maybe we can push Ethereum L1 to include one of those Pepsi fancy things.
Gotcha. Okay, good to hear that you're considering it for the devnets and testnets. Any final question before we wrap up the public part of the call and open it up to the private after discussion? Sasha just shared his Telegram handle in the chat if you want to talk to him directly. Okay, thank you, everyone. This wraps up the public part of the call. Now opening it up to anyone who wants to bring up any topic of their choice.